From the Ozark foothills of northeast Arkansas, I'm Carl Richardson, and this is Midnight Frequency Radio. Our guest this evening is Peter Davenport. Peter Davenport has been a director of the National UFO Reporting Center since 1994. He has also served as the director of investigations for the Washington chapter of MUFON. Peter experienced his first UFO sighting over St. Louis Municipal Airport in the summer of 1954 and investigated his first UFO case during the summer of 1965 in Exeter, New Hampshire. He has been witness to several subsequent anomalous events, including dramatic sighting over Baja California in February of 1990 and several nighttime sightings over Washington State during 1992. Peter received his undergraduate education at Stanford when he earned his bachelor's degree in both Russian and biology, as well as a translator certificate in Russian translation. His graduate education was completed at the University of Washington, where he earned an MS in the genetics and biochemistry of fish from the College of Fisheries, as well as an MBA in finance and international business from the Graduate School of Business. Peter has worked as a college instructor, a commercial fisherman, a Russian translator in the Soviet Union, a fisheries observer around Soviet fishing vessels, a flight instructor, and was the founder of the Seattle-based biotechnology company. He was a candidate for the Washington State Legislature in 1986 and for the U.S. House of Representatives in 1992. Good evening, Mr. Davenport, and welcome to Midnight Frequency Radio.
Good evening, Carl, and I'm delighted to be here. It's great to have an opportunity to speak with somebody who was so close to Art Bell. Did a number of really exciting programs together.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. I guess I should start by asking, how did everything lead up to you becoming the National UFO Reporting Center director?
Well, quite by accident. The last Friday in July of 1994, I was talking to Robert J. Gribble, who was the founder of the hotline. Bob Gribble was fascinated by the UFO subject. He'd never seen a UFO himself, but he knew they existed. And I called him. I heard he was considering shutting down the hotline, which had run for 20 years by 1994. And we talked about it. I offered my help to help him keep it up and running. And before that conversation was over, he said, "Peter, it's yours." From that point forward, I've been responsible for the operation of probably one of the most well-known hotlines in the United States. Been a lot of work. I've never worked as hard as I have over the last 31 years.
I bet you take a lot of phone calls. Are they staying fairly consistent, or have they slacked off?
Well, they've increased in frequency, actually. We used to take 8 or maybe 10 or 12 calls a day 30 years ago, and we're now taking 20 to 50 calls. And fortunately, many people are just going to the online report form on our website, which is ufocenter.com, and submitting written reports, which is a big help to us. So the volume of reports has increased. I don't know why that is. It may just be that people feel more comfortable talking about the subject and sharing their personal experiences.
Did you get a lot of calls during the Phoenix Lights?
Oh, boy, that was quite a night. The call started about, I think it was 7:15 at night, Seattle time. And I didn't turn off this hotline until about 3:45 that night. I've never spent a night working so hard in my life. And as you may know, Art and I did a program that night on the subject. He was getting calls and I was getting calls. He called me and said, "Peter, what are you getting?" And I told him, and he said, "We'll have you on tonight." It was one of the most memorable radio appearances I've ever had.
I think I remember listening to that one live when it was all going down.
Yeah.
You had your own UFO sighting.
Yeah, that's even more than my taking over the hotline. It was my sighting. I think it was in late summer, July or August, maybe September of 1954. I was 6.5 years of age. And I'd love to tell the story. It's rather exciting to me.
Well, you're welcome to do so.
Uh, my father worked for a major American airline at the St. Louis airport, and he was station manager for them, which meant he frequently had to go out to his office at night to do some work in preparation for the next day. And one night, my father, my mother, my older brother, and I drove to the airport and dropped my father off on the north side of the St. Louis airport. And then my mother and brother and I went around to the south side to a drive-in theater, which was very popular in those days, called the Airway Cinema. Long story short, midway through the film, people started getting out of their cars and running. They were running to our right. I looked out the side window of our family car, a 53 Studebaker, and there was the most bizarre looking craft I'd ever seen in my life. And being the son of an airline employee, I prided myself in being able to identify almost any kind of airplane that went into St. Louis. I could tell DC-6s from DC-7s just by their sound, for example.
Yes, sir.
And I looked out the right side of that Studebaker, and there was an object that was so bright red, fire engine red, and disc-shaped with a cupola on top. It was so bright I didn't want to look at it. It hurt my eyes. And suddenly, after a few seconds that I'd watched it, it accelerated just like a marble coming out of a slingshot. And It went behind the screen, and I thought at that point that we were done with it. A few seconds later, it rose up from behind the screen straight up, and then did a small radius turn and came straight down again behind the screen, so we couldn't see it, but we could see the light radiating from it. Then when I finally thought we were done with it, it shot to the northwest, went behind some buildings of McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, and I've been a slave to the UFO question ever since. That planted a seed in my mind, and I want to help answer the question of what these things are. I think I know, but we don't have the proof yet.
Well,
but that was my introduction to the UFO field.
Well, that's a wild one for sure. If I'd have saw something like that, I'd be like you, majorly involved with it.
Yeah.
Has the mission of the National UFO Reporting Center evolved since its inception?
Is it involved in what, please?
Has it evolved since its inception, its beginning?
Oh, yes, I think principally because of the internet. Whereas Bob Gribble used to take most of his information over the telephone and request that people submit written reports using the postal system, we now have the benefit of a internet that allows people to communicate much more rapidly via email. And now, because of websites, we can reduce the load on the personnel at the center. That's principally me. And it's a much more sophisticated operation, much smoother now.
Well, I'm sure that makes it easier and keeps you from being on the phone as much. I sure hope it does.
Yeah, I'm trying to urge people, and while we're on that subject, I'd like to make a point to share with our listeners. One thing I've observed over 31 years of operating the hotline is people who believe they've seen a UFO are questioning to talk about it. They want to tell somebody. The problem is we're taking so many phone calls now that I don't have the luxury of being able to spend half an hour or an hour listening to somebody's report And that's where our online report form comes in, which allows people to submit their reports in written form, which is important because we can't post a telephone conversation to our website very easily. A written report is far better than an oral report over the telephone. So
you probably get more details that way.
yeah, and it's something that is indelible. We encourage people to write out a detailed written account of what they saw, to include where they were, what the time and date were, what direction they were looking, the angle of elevation, whether other people were present, what color the object was. All that information is crucially important for another person to be able to understand what the witness observed. So I'd invite our listeners tonight at their leisure, even if they haven't seen a UFO, to go to our website. Again, that address is ufocenter.com, very easy to remember, and familiarize themselves with the report form such that if they see something unusual, they are familiar with the operation, or if they encounter somebody who tells them that he's seen a UFO, to encourage that witness to submit his own report.
Yes, sir.
We've, since we set up our website in 1996, I believe it was, we've accumulated 170,000 reports that now, because of our webmasters, they're what's called sortable in the computer parlance. They're able to select the type of craft seen or the location. There are all sorts of criteria they can use to sort those 170,000 reports and get what they're looking for.
What's a typical report that you would get on a sighting?
Well, the most common report, I feel, is not of a UFO. We get a lot of things reported that don't have anything to do with alien spacecraft, I feel. For example, in urban areas, there are a lot of advertising lights that circle and shone up on the bottom sides of clouds. And incredibly, to my great surprise, we get a lot of reports like that. It's typically 4 lights that are circulating in a circle, and they go out and then come back together to a point. And somebody seasoned in receiving UFO reports can spot that type of event pretty quickly. A lot of people report stars, and they report that they couldn't be a star because they're hopping around in the sky. Most astronomers are quite familiar with that phenomenon. It turns out if you stare at a bright object against a dark background for more than maybe a few seconds, 15 or 20 seconds, because of the constant flickering of the human eye, many unskilled observers will believe that the source of light is moving, hopping around. Well, we can spot those reports fairly quickly. A lot of people report satellites. I'm quite surprised by the number of people I've encountered who have never seen a satellite in the night sky. But people report the International Space Station quite frequently.
I keep track of the International Space Station for ham radio purposes, but I've got the tracking software on my computer that helps locate it.
Yeah. We try to educate people when we get reports that are not UFOs and encourage them to investigate on their own and explore and familiarize themselves with websites that track satellites and most of all the space station. One type of report we get very commonly is of Starlink satellites.
Oh, yeah.
When they first went up, we got a lot of really very excited people. I talked to one pilot who was halfway from Los Angeles to Honolulu, and he saw a Starlink cluster go over, and he admitted that he was tempted to turn his plane back around and go back to Los Angeles. It was so shocking to him. He just didn't know about the program. But many more people now are familiar with that project, and we don't get nearly as many calls as we used to.
Are there any new technologies that y'all are looking at, like passive radar?
Yeah. Oh, I'd be delighted to talk about that. It's if a person who knows my work were to ask somebody, what is Peter Davenport's greatest contribution to ufology? Most people would say, well, it's those 170,000 reports he's collected over 31 years. But in point of fact, I would differ with that person because I think my proposal to use reflected signals emanating from commercial radio and television stations is my greatest contribution. And I'm shocked that it hasn't caught on with greater interest than it has. I can tell a story of how I came up with it.
Yes,
In
sir.
January, it was the Friday before Martin Luther King weekend, January of 1995. I'd been running the hotline for 4 or 5 months. I was exhausted and a little bit concerned because the job was taking up my entire day from wake up to lights out, and I hadn't allowed for devoting that amount of time to running the hotline. And I said to myself, there's got to be a better way to detect UFOs than using an eyewitness who describes it verbally. And then it suddenly hit me. In the mid-1980s, I used to work in the venture investment business, venture capital. And our company was approached by a company in Kent, Washington called Meteor Communications Corp. And they built equipment. They consisted of ex-Boeing engineers who were laid off in the early 70s. And they decided to set up their own company. And they designed equipment that was intended to reflect a radio signal off the ionized trail behind a meteor. And they could skip, you're a ham radio operator, I seem to recall.
Yes, sir.
So you understand the principle of skipping a signal. The trail behind meteors is extremely hot from the friction and the exothermic reaction of striking the atmosphere. And it hit me like a landslide that if they could detect trails behind meteors with their equipment, what else could they detect that reflected radio waves? And I was ecstatic because I felt I'd solved a major problem of ufology, namely detecting UFOs with radar. And I wrote an article for the MUFON Journal, their monthly publication, describing my proposal, thinking that I was going to be overwhelmed with interest, overwhelmed by people who recognized the power of that technology. And after my article was published, I got one communication. I think I didn't describe the technology clearly enough so my reading audience could understand what I was talking about. And then in 1964 or 1994, no, I think it was 1990, well, 4 years later anyway.
Yes, sir.
I wrote another article. I'd been invited to speak at the MUFON Symposium in Denver, and I decided I didn't want to talk about more cases. Taking a UFO sighting case to a MUFON Symposium is like carrying a cup of salt water to Honolulu. What good does it do?
Yeah.
So I decided I wanted to do something radical. I decided I'd do it on passive radar. And the reason I tell this story is I wrote about an 8 or 10 page article describing my proposal, and it was published in the proceedings of the symposium on the 6th of July. I think it was 2002, if I'm not mistaken. The day my article was published, I got a call. Caller ID said Central Intelligence Agency. I picked it up, and it was a senior executive at the CIA with a PhD who called me up, and he said, "Peter, you don't know me, but I know you from your appearances on Coast to Coast." He said, "I just had a retired colleague of mine at the Central Intelligence Agency put a copy of the synopsis of your article on my desk. He said, I'm calling to congratulate you. If you build the system you propose in your article, you'll be successful in answering the question of whether UFOs are real or not. He didn't say you'll detect UFOs. I suspect that would have had him violating a secrecy agreement, but he was very upbeat and very flattering about my article. And we finally have a gentleman out in Colorado who's built a prototype of it, and it seems to work. I think it's going to revolutionize ufology because we'll be able to detect UFOs at high altitude and traveling very fast. I'm very excited about the project.
I'd be excited once everything gets up and running real good. I'd love to hear how it's working. It's an amazing idea that you came up with.
It's really very simple. I'm surprised that it took so long for somebody to recognize that you could use radiated radio and television signals as a form of radar. And I'm very excited about it. And perhaps I'll report initial results on midnight frequency at a later date. I'd love to do that.
Oh, I'd be thrilled. That would be fantastic.
The thing that really surprises me, though, is that so few people have expressed an interest in it. It answers the question of whether UFOs are real or not. And I had a terribly difficult time trying to get funding or any kind of interest in the project at all. But things seem to be changing a bit.
How do you go about with the funding? Is it even with the reporting center? How are you funded?
Principally by me.
Do you take donations?
We do indeed. And we're a Washington State nonprofit, but we don't have 501c3 status. So for the time being, you can't deduct contributions, but people have made very generous contributions that have been crucially important in paying the phone bill and keeping the lights on and paying computer connections. So we welcome even small donations are a big help.
If someone wanted to donate, is there a place on the website with information? Or
there is. I think there's a box they can fill out and forward money through PayPal to our corporate account, and they can always mail a check. Our address is on our website. Again, that website address is ufocenter.com. And thank you for asking that question.
Well, no problem. And I also have a link to your website on my site, so they can always go to
thank you.
midnightfrequency.net and click on your link.
Thank you.
Let's do our first break, and then we'll come back.
Okay.
This is Dark Matter News. I'm Joshua Stark. Scientists have just revealed that ice samples from the remote Allen Hills region of Antarctica contained air bubbles that are approximately 6 million years old, making them the oldest directly dated frozen air samples ever recovered. An international research team obtained long ice core cylinders by drilling between 100 and 200 meters deep into the ice at the Allen Hills site, where mountainous terrain and slow ice flow allowed very old ice to be preserved close to the surface. These cores contained trapped atmospheric gases, essentially time capsule samples of Earth's ancient air. By analyzing isotopic and chemical signatures in the kernels of trapped air, the scientists found that over the past 6 million years, the region was cooled by roughly 12 centigrade or 22 Fahrenheit, fitting with the other data indicating the planet was significantly warmer in the distant past. The discovery far exceeded our expectations, say the researchers, who had originally hoped to find ice just a few million years old, not 6. While the record is not yet continuous, there are gaps in the stratigraphy. There are opening doors for probing Earth's climate further back in time than previously possible. The findings highlight just how unique the Allen Hills location is. Extreme cold, strong winds that may scour new snow combine to preserve ancient frozen archives near the surface. Catch up with us at darkmatternews.com.
Hi, this is Jessica with C. Crane. Tired of spotty radio reception and static? C. Crane CC Wi-Fi 3 Internet Radio offers a crystal clear solution with audio guaranteed to outperform any smartphone speaker. With an internet connection, tune in to over 30,000 radio stations from around the world, all conveniently accessible without needing any apps, providing personal information, or additional monthly subscriptions. Enjoy complete privacy with no microphone or eavesdropping. The CC Wi-Fi 3 boasts a user-friendly interface with a full-sized remote for easy control. It also doubles as a Bluetooth speaker for your favorite music and podcasts. Ready to upgrade your listening experience? You can get the CC Wi-Fi 3 by calling C. Crane at 800-522-8863 or by visiting us online at ccrane.com. Once again, that's CCRANE.com.
2024 is now likely the hottest Earth has been in at least 125,000 years, according to a new report. The assessment shows nearly 2/3 of Earth's measurable vital signs, from greenhouse gases to ocean heat to ice sheet mass, are at record extremes. The findings warn we're in what scientists call ecological overshoot, consuming resources faster than the planet can renew them. Key drivers include rising carbon dioxide and methane levels, shrinking reflectivity of snow and ice causing more heat absorption, and fewer sunlight-reflecting aerosols in the atmosphere. The report emphasizes that avoiding even fractions of a degree of further warming makes a major difference. This is Dark Matter News.
I can see her lying back in her satin dress, in a room where you do what you don't confess. Sundown, you better take care if I find you've been creeping round my back stairs. Sundown, you better take care if I find you've been creeping round my back.
All right, welcome back to Midnight Frequency Radio and our guest, Peter Davenport. Mr. Davenport, are there some things about the Phoenix Lights you'd like to elaborate on?
Yeah, I'd welcome that. I've mentioned it earlier in this program, and I like to talk about it because, in my opinion, it's probably the most dramatic appearance of UFOs that's occurred in the last 31 years that I've been collecting cases. I will never forget that night. I got a phone call at about 7:15 Seattle time. I was working out of Seattle at the time, and a retired police officer said that he left his home in his pickup truck and was driving through his neighborhood, and he looked to the west and he saw, I think it was 6 lights streaking across the sky. It was so bizarre in appearance that it caused him to turn his truck around and go back home out of concern for his family's safety. But that incident lasted for at least 2 hours, and it was the most dramatic UFO event I can think of at this moment. One of the interesting aspects, after I'd worked all night, as I mentioned earlier in this program, on the night of the Phoenix Lights, I turned the telephone off at about 3:15 or so in the early morning, Friday morning, or thought I had turned it off. And I went to bed and the phone rang. I didn't want to take another report, but I'm glad I did. It was a call from a Air Force airman, U.S. Air Force airman, who had been on duty at the airbase just west of Phoenix, and he proceeded to tell me that he had been involved in a scramble of two F-15Cs that had been part of the U.S. Air Force One and Air Force Two protection group. And I have reason to believe that the two pilots who scrambled earlier that day had been part of the detail that had chaperoned President Clinton's flight from Washington, D.C. down to Florida to allow the president to go golfing with Greg Norman, the professional golfer from Australia. And this airman had helped in the scramble of the aircraft and the retrieval of them. When they parked on their hot pads, at least one of the pilots could not get out of the cockpit under his own steam. So his ground crew opened the canopy, undid his safety straps, and proceeded to lift him out of the cockpit and get him upright on the platform beside the aircraft. All this while, the pilot was describing to them what he had just seen. And at one point, he described an object so large that it stretched from the left side of his canopy to the right side of his canopy in the night sky. They approached it from the north. And at that point, many people on the ground were looking up at an object that intersected an arc of about 155 degrees, between 130 and 150. And the pilot reported that he had intercepted it at 9,000 feet above ground level. Any of our listeners who've had trigonometry or who work with trigonometry will tell you that allows you to calculate the actual size of the object. That object, if our data is correct, 9,000 feet above and at least 135 degrees of arc, that describes an object that was 8.23 miles in width.
Good God, that's huge.
Everybody who saw them, and there were either 5 or 6 objects that hovered and streaked over the Phoenix area that night, but everybody who saw one expressed an opinion that they were huge craft, almost indescribably large. A lot of people attempted to estimate their size, but they didn't know the distance to the object, so their estimate is probably without foundation. But 9,000 feet above ground level, subtending an arc of, let's say, 135 degrees, and that translates to an object over 8 miles from wingtip to wingtip.
And I guess the government stood behind their statement that it was flares and as a cover-up.
Yeah. One thing I pointed out in our article I wrote about the Phoenix Lights, I think for the MUFON Journal, was the night that President Clinton spent the night at Greg Norman's home in Florida, during which he was eating a hamburger and drinking a soft drink, when allegedly the tendons in his knee gave out. The president had to be evacuated from that home back to Washington, D.C. to undergo surgery. My suspicion is the president may have been moved, not because he was injured, but because of what was going on in Phoenix. People recognized, the Air Force Base out west of Phoenix chained their gates shut with chains. They sealed the base off during the scramble and during the sighting of those 6 craft that loitered over Phoenix. It was quite a night. And
I believe the media dropped the ball on the reporting of that too, didn't they? I think Art had made comments that same night.
They sure did. There was one young reporter from Prescott, Arizona. I think it was the Prescott Courier, if I'm not mistaken. I've forgotten the journalist's name, but her article in that Prescott newspaper was the only article that came out for quite some time. How the government is able to convince people to either not report news or to report false news is beyond me.
Yeah, it is me too. Were there any other military reports? I'm only aware of the ones where they were just reported it was flares. Did anything else come out at a later date?
Well, there was a lot of subsequent investigation. I'd like to compliment the director of MUFON. He did a great job of meeting with people and collecting data initially very soon after the event. Also, I'd like to compliment the late Dr. Michael Tanner, who did the same, working together with Jim Dilatoso. And they went out numerous times to meet with actual eyewitnesses, while the eyewitnesses were standing on the point where they were located during the event. And they succeeded in recovering a lot of data which would have been lost otherwise if they hadn't gotten it soon after the event.
Do you think that disclosures, that we're on the brink of disclosure with all the government hearings and stuff, or do you think they're still trying to, well, it's apparent they're still trying to cover things up because most of the answers they get in the Senate hearings is people saying, I can't discuss it or I'm not at liberty to say, so.
Yeah. I don't understand the government's position at all. All I can conclude is it's one based on panic. They're alarmed by what's going on. And I'd go back to that gentleman from the CIA I mentioned earlier in this program who said that if we build equipment and monitor events in the atmosphere, it will answer the question of whether UFOs are real or not. He's well known in the UFO community, and he seems to be genuinely interested in the UFO subject. That's been the case for decades now. So,
how do you deal with the negative scientific skepticism of UFOs and UAPs?
Well, I'll give them a little time and cite data such as the Phoenix Lights case. By the way, I'd like to interject something. I left out one of the most important investigators in the Phoenix area of the Phoenix Lights, Dr. Lynn Kitai, a physician who's all but abandoned her medical career in order to continue to collect data from eyewitnesses. She's done a magnificent job. But back to your question, Carl, I encounter skeptics once in a while, but I don't spend a lot of time with them. I invite them to look at the data and talk to people who've seen them, allegedly, but I just don't have the time to endure their naivete in the subject of UFOs.
Yeah, it's probably just better to stay away from the naysayers, I would imagine.
Yeah, although I believe that the frequency or the volume of naysayers and skeptics is diminishing. People are beginning to understand that not everybody who claims to have seen a UFO is mentally imbalanced. A lot of these people are very skilled. I've received reports from former astronauts, from military pilots, and one type of case that I'm seeing much more frequently than used to be the case is reports from airline pilots and co-pilots. Over the last roughly year or two, I've gotten a number of sightings, reports from senior aircraft pilots, senior pilots, and they're mystified by what they've seen. One thing I'd add, if people are interested in seeing high quality reports, they can sort our data and select those cases that are submitted by pilots, and they can read pilot reports all day long. There are quite a number of them. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
That's okay. On the pilots, are they still reluctant to report, or are they just finally past that point and they report what they see?
There may be some out there who are recalcitrant and don't want to get involved and are afraid of what might happen to them or their career as pilots. I find that a lot of pilots are more than happy to talk about what they saw. It brings one case to mind from I think it was about 1996 or 97. A young pilot was flying from Nantucket Island out east of Massachusetts, and he was on his way to Grenier Field in southeastern New Hampshire, my old stomping grounds. And they had a big buildup of weather over Boston, so the pilot had to skirt around thunderstorms by going west of Boston over Rhode Island. And when he was just passing over the shore of Rhode Island, he looked out ahead of his aircraft. It was a Pilatus PC-12 transporter, single-engine turboprop. He was carrying passengers on this particular flight. He looked out ahead of his aircraft and he saw what he thought was a soaring bird, a large soaring bird. And he glanced down in his cockpit for just a second and looked back at this obstruction to make sure he was going to fly around it. And then he realized that it wasn't stationary. It was streaking at his aircraft. And he said he saw it up close only for a few seconds, but it looked like a egg-shaped object, charcoal black, no emblems, no insignias, no engines, no windows, no means of propulsion whatsoever. And it streaked, he estimated that it passed within 50 vertical feet of his starboard wing. He got on the radio and called air traffic control and asked them if they had anything on radar. Initially, they said, no, we don't see anything. a few seconds later, they come back on and say, we see it now. It has reversed its course and it's tracking your aircraft. We got the FAA official audio on that one, and you can hear them state that it reversed its course of travel very suddenly and was tracking the aircraft. So the pilot called the hotline and gave us an excellent report. Really very exciting.
How many of these reports do you think are reverse engineered crafts by our own government as opposed to extraterrestrial origin?
There may be some of those. People will report anything that they can't first identify, reported as a UFO. That's a good point, Carl. And I suspect, I know people have reported the B-2 bomber as a UFO who are not familiar with that aircraft, the type that was used on the attack on Iran several months ago. But most of the time, in talking with the witness, you can get enough information to give you a fair chance of identifying the object if it is something of terrestrial origin. There may be some projects that we don't know about, but...
Like Bob Lazar's experience at X4.
Yes. I know Bob, and I hold his story in very high regard.
I do too, and I'd really like to have him on the show, but he's been on with Art so many times and George Knapp and other interviewers. He may be past all that.
Yeah.
But he's got a new, I don't know if it's going to be a movie or a documentary called The Bob Lazar Story, S4. And I'd like to have him on discussing that because they actually made computer-generated 3D images of S4 and the craft that were there. That should be really interesting.
On the subject of that piece of property out in Nevada, I just received a book, a thick paperback book. I don't know the title of it, from a friend. He saw it in a bookstore and thought of me, mailed me a copy. I'm yet to get into it, but it's a much more complex story than I had allowed for. Area 51 has been carved up into a number of different areas designated or devoted to different projects. I was not aware of that.
I really wasn't either until he started talking about S4 and gave the coordinates, and you could locate it on the map. It's close to Papoose Lake. If you can send me an email or something in the future when you get the name of that book that you were sent, I would like to find a copy and read it myself.
I'll do that tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. There are a number of reports I'd like to share with our audience, if I may.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I've got a 7-page document I generated with just 2-line summaries of some of the most exciting, well-documented cases I've covered or processed over the last 31 years. One stands out in my mind. It's from Eklutna, Alaska, 1936, October 1936. Eklutna was an Indian village out east of Anchorage at that time. It's no longer a residential area, I'm told. But 2 gentlemen who were employees of the conservation CCC they worked a Saturday, and the only days they had off were Sundays. So they were in the habit of leaving their camp in Eklutna in the early evening hours of Saturdays and hitchhiking into Anchorage. They would spend the night in the jail. They'd have a meal or go to a bar or do something entertaining. On this particular night in October of 1936, they write that they were walking to the west, a little worried about their welfare because it was a cold night. There was snow on the ground, and they hadn't dressed warmly enough for the trip into Anchorage. They looked to the west and suddenly saw a blue-green light, apparently the size of the moon in the night sky, streaking towards them, and it got close to them and suddenly stopped and hovered above them in the night sky. And the next thing they knew, they were waking up covered in snow. They'd been buried in snow, apparently to protect them from the cold. It's quite a remarkable story.
It is. That's wild.
Many people feel or believe that the UFO phenomenon began in the 1940s, 1947, for example, with the alleged crash saucer. But it appears to me that based on many of the reports that have been submitted by older folks, that it's been going on for a long time before that. We're just beginning to get a glimpse into what we're dealing with.
Do you get a lot of similar stories to Travis Walton's?
Similar stories?
Yeah. Do you
See,
get...
yeah. I know Travis well, and I hold him in extremely high regard. I've listened to his stories for probably 20 or 25 years of his experience, and they're always the same. I consider him to be a truth speaker. He experienced something that night that was very real.
Yeah, his co-workers did too, but they ended up getting accused of murder. So.
Yeah. Travis apparently was taken up into a mothership, I think the story is.
Yeah, I think he was experimented on, and then after a period of time, they brought him back.
Yeah. I've sat over dinner with him and listened to his story and listened to his thoughts on what happened to him and so on. And it's just a remarkable story. It's one of 2 or 3 events in the UFO community that I think is a leading candidate for being the most dramatic case we know of.
Yeah. Do you have some other stories you'd like to tell us about?
I'm sorting through 170,000, trying to pick up the good ones.
That's a lot of literature to go through. Huh?
Yeah. One story I'd like to share with our audience comes from Chalice, Idaho. And I don't have the date in front of me. I think it was 2002. A group of 4 men from Bend, Oregon, had a hunting area that they visited every hunting season. They'd done this for 20 years. And one night they'd been out. They weren't hunting so much as photographing game. It was just before the hunting season. And they were in their trailer watching movies that they'd taken of animals during the day, and it came time to prepare dinner. So one of the 4 members of the hunting party slipped out of the trailer and started walking towards his pickup truck, and he put his foot on the rear tire and swung himself up. As he swung up into the bed of the truck, his flashlight swept across the night sky, and his peripheral vision picked up the fact that there was something solid above him, which caused him to fall off the truck. And he saw a very large triangular-shaped craft hovering directly above their camp, probably 100 meters in length or so. So it was a very sizable craft. The other 3 members of the party thought he'd been attacked by some predator. They came barreling out of their trailer to help him, and he just pointed up, and they looked up, and all 4 of them saw the triangular craft. And at that moment, it turned on all its lights, and it started moving to the northeast towards fairly high mountains relatively slowly. It wasn't in any hurry, apparently. And that report is on our website, Chalice, Idaho, which is in the northern part of the state. It's a very rural area, I'm told. But I've spoken with 2 of the witnesses, and they're very convincing. There's no doubt in my mind that what their story is true. It's really a remarkable story. And the next day, well, the night of the sighting, 2 brothers who were in the party decided they didn't want to stay out at the remote area all night, so they jumped in their trucks, loaded their deer rifles, and drove into the nearest town, which I think was Chalice. They spent the night in a motel room, feeling much safer. They drove back to the camp the next morning, not knowing what they would find, only to discover that just prior to their arrival, 2 F-16 jets had gone over the camp at very high speed. The 2 guys who spent the night in the motel had called the Air Force and apprised them of the situation, and they think that that explains the presence of those F-16s. The Air Force was apparently very interested in what the witnesses could tell the Air Force. It was a dramatic case.
It sounds like it. Are there any other cases that stick out to you as really interesting?
Yes. I'll go back to the 1930s again. This is probably the year of or the year after the event at Klutna, Alaska, that I mentioned a few moments ago. Fontana, California. 3 young boys were returning from a trip to the local movie house to watch a movie. They were walking through orange groves, and suddenly the whole area around them was illuminated intensely brightly from something that was hovering above them. And they looked up and saw a craft projecting a very bright light on them. Suddenly the light went out and the craft streaked off and disappeared in the night sky. It was a good case.
Do you have people in the field that help you with the reportings and stuff that volunteer? Or?
Unfortunately not. I wish we had a facility, a staff, and a budget, but all of the work is currently being done by two people, by me and by Christian Stepien, who's worked as the webmaster for the last 30 years.
Well, if you have anything in Northeast Arkansas, let me know, and I'll help as much as I can possibly do it.
Oh, I thank you for the offer. Very kind of you. I'll make sure that if we have any reports from that neck of the woods, that we'll turn them over to you. Do you do investigation?
I can, and I can be objective, so, you'll get a decent report from me.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know. We may come banging on your door before you know it.
I need to do my last break, and then if maybe we can come back and close out, or if you have some more stuff you'd like to discuss, we can do that.
Okay, good. I've got a lot of stuff.
Okay. We'll be right back. You got about 5 minutes if you need to step away, too.
Okay, thank you.
This is Dark Matter News. I'm Joshua Stark. A new look at eerie hauntings reveal a more earthly culprit behind many ghost stories: carbon monoxide poisoning. According to research published on IFL Science, toxicologists are finding that symptoms commonly associated with hauntings, hallucinations, sense of dread, pressure on the chest, strange sounds, may be caused by low toxic exposures to carbon monoxide and other gases. Historical case documents back this up. One 1921 report describes a family in a haunted house scenario: pale children, the father seeing a woman in black, the mother dreaming of being strangled, all ultimately traced to a faulty furnace and carbon monoxide leakage. The hallmarks match classic ghost phenomena. More recently, writer Carrie Poppy experienced auditory hallucinations and a crushing chest feeling at home. After investigation, she discovered a gas leak. She later admitted the symptoms align closely with known carbon monoxide poisoning effects. Experts emphasize not all hauntings stem from poisoning. Some may be genuinely psychological, some hoaxes, others sleep paralysis or suggestibility, or something real. But the link is strong enough that toxicologist Albert Donay argues it helps explain the proliferation of haunted house reports in the Victorian era, where indoor stoves, gas lighting, and poor ventilation were common. So on your next ghost hunt, be safe. Check those carbon monoxide levels. That's it for Dark Matter News. Catch up with us on the Midnight Frequency Facebook page. From Memphis, Tennessee, I'm Joshua Stark.
The word amateur, it can mean a lack of skill, but today's amateur radio operators provide skilled emergency communications when the chips are down simply because they want to be of service to the community. Dependable, reliable, free of charge. Amateur radio emergency services operators are amateurs in the best sense of the word. Join us.
The CC Skywave SSB2 is a Swiss Army knife of portable radios. The Skywave SSB2 has wide and accurate band coverage in a small size, which makes it an excellent travel and emergency radio. Single sideband is a reliable way to get long-range information after an earthquake or hurricane when normal communications are down. The SSB tuning is accurate to 10 Hz resolution. It also covers civilian aviation, VHF, with 10 aviation memories that can continuously scan for activity. It also covers AM, FM, and weather with alert. To get your CC Skywave SSB2, call us at 1-800-522-8863 or visit us on the web at ccrane.com. Once again, that's CCRANE.com.
And I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder. One of the four beasts saying, "Come and see." And I saw, and behold, a white horse. There's a man going round taking names, and he decides who to free and who to blame. Everybody won't be treated all the same. There'll be a golden ladder reaching down when the man comes around. The hairs on your arm will stand up.
Welcome back to Midnight Frequency Radio and our guest, Peter Davenport. And Mr. Davenport, do you have some more stories you'd like to let us hear about?
I sure do. In fact, I have a surfeit of reports. Could fill up a week. But I'd like to return to that very generous introduction you made at the beginning of the program. You mentioned that I'd investigated the so-called incident at Exeter. Exeter, New Hampshire is a town in the southeastern part of the state. I graduated from high school in 1965, and I spent that summer of 65 working for the local newspaper, the Derry News. And interestingly, the editor, Mr. Conrad Quimby, and I had argued about UFOs for a long time. I had told him about the one I saw over St. Louis Airport that I described in the early part of this program. And he was one of the hardest skeptics I know. Well, as fate would have it, on the 3rd of September 1965, a bunch of people saw a disc-shaped craft over southeastern New Hampshire. It's become to be known as the incident at Exeter. A Boston columnist, John Fuller, wrote a book on it entitled The Incident at Exeter. It's an excellent coverage of what happened. The culmination of the sighting was quite interesting. There were two Exeter police officers who had been taken out, who'd chaperoned a 18-year-old hitchhiker who had seen this craft. They were standing on a very rural road in New Hampshire, and they watched a disc flit around about a 40-acre field for 10 or 15 minutes. And it was a very dramatic case. I highly recommend the book Incident at Exeter by John G. Fuller. It's one of my prized library books on the subject of UFOs.
Is that available on Amazon?
Probably is. I don't know how many were printed, but I have a copy myself.
I'll try to snag me up one if it's available.
Another case I'd like to discuss comes to us from September 9th, 1994. I had just taken over the hotline, and I got a call one morning from a school nurse in Northern California who said that a young girl had walked into her office at the school talking about being taken aboard a craft and the little men that asked her if she wanted to take a ride. And
I'd say, yeah, sure do.
yeah, I'm not sure I want to go on one of them, despite my interest in the subject. But the reason I mention this case is it had some very solid witnesses. The night before the morning encounter by this girl at a bus stop, there were several reports from the Santa Barbara area. The FAA had reported to us that pilots were reporting lights streaking by their aircraft. And the other reason I cite this case in Northern California, again, this is September 9th, 1994, there was an incident in Rhodesia called the Ariel case, and it involved school children, and it occurred a week to the day following the incident in Northern California. Children actually saw creatures and saw a craft outside the boundaries of their rural school in Rhodesia. So people are seeing things all the time, and if it were not for somebody, some poor sod like me who's a slave to the UFO phenomenon, this information would be lost forever, I'm afraid.
It's good that the people that do come forward, I'm sure it's extremely helpful.
Yeah, the real heroes in the UFO hotline are the people who call, for one thing, but even more than that, the people who follow up with an excellent written report that we can post to our website. If it were not for those people who are willing to share their time and devote it to capturing the information while it's fresh, we wouldn't have much at all, I'm afraid.
I've seen lights in the sky before, but I'm not, it could have been Venus or another planet. But if I ever see a UFO that I can't explain, you'll be the first to get a report from me.
Yeah, there are many things that people see that they can't explain that aren't alien spacecraft. But I'm searching, if I sound like I'm stumbling, I'm searching for some of the better stories, some of the better reports.
Oh, yes, sir. Take your time.
February 25th, 1996, a young man was driving near Doylestown, Pennsylvania, when he saw some lights streaking towards the van he was driving, and suddenly the engine stopped inexplicably. Well, engine stopped for a host of reasons, but the interesting aspect of this event was after the lights had passed over his van, without activating the key, the starter, the engine started running again. It had stopped and spontaneously began running. Another case that I had actually investigated comes to us from February 25th of 1999. This is a good one. I include this one in my public presentations. February 25th, 99, 14 or perhaps as many as 16 forestry workers were out west of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington, and their foreman, who was overseeing the planting of seedling trees in the mountains, got up to blow his whistle for lunch, and he looked to the east, and he saw what he thought was a ultralight aircraft, or perhaps a paraglider. He quickly called the attention of all his workers to it. Some of them were already looking at it, and they quickly realized after a short period of time that it wasn't a paraglider at all. It was some kind of bizarre craft that was hugging the contour of the trees, tops of the trees. And these workers had been watching a herd of elk down below them in a small valley. And suddenly that herd of elk broke for heavy timber, ostensibly to get more cover. They sensed this object. All of them except one lone, they think it was an adult female elk, broke for cover. But this object went after that lone elk, got directly above it, according to the witnesses, and lifted it off the ground, at which point the elk appeared to the witnesses to just suddenly go limp. It was either unconscious or perhaps dead. And it carried the elk just disappeared into the ventral surface of the craft. The craft then moved slowly towards the herd and bumped into the tops of trees, almost as if it could not get over them. Well, it backed away from the trees, and it did a 360-degree turn and suddenly accelerated, just like a marble's being shot out of a slingshot to the north, and disappeared from their sight. I talked with 6 of the witnesses, and they were very convincing.
I don't doubt that they were telling the truth.
Yep.
Do you think a lot of cattle mutilations are extraterrestrial related?
I have that sense of it, Carl. The absence of blood seems significant. The absence of the apparent incisions on the animals seem to be mysterious, something that couldn't be duplicated even by a skilled surgeon. But I haven't investigated many cases, and I just don't know. I hesitate to take a position without having more information.
I understand that. Do you have any more stories or events?
Oh, yes. I'm scanning a list here of reports.
While you're looking through that, if anyone had the interest in getting involved with UFO research, would you have any advice to recommend them?
Yes, I'd most of all encourage them not to get too deeply into it because it's very difficult to make a living at it unless you can support yourself through other means. And it's a lot of work and not always gratifying work. But if you have the hook set in your jaw for UFOs, I think probably the best thing to do is to contact your local MUFON chapter and become an investigator. MUFON does a lot of good work. I used to be a member of it. I used to be a state section director.
Does Arkansas have a MUFON chapter?
Arkansas?
Yes, sir.
I suspect they do. I don't know who the state director is, but you could probably find them by doing a scan of the internet.
I'll do that probably right after the show this evening. Of course, I've got some editing due on to get this all uploaded, but find another event.
One, I mentioned airline pilots in the year 2000, and I don't know the date for this. I could find it if I had more time. Two pilots were flying to the east over Dallas. They were flying from the East Coast or West Coast one to Florida and one to, I think, Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. And they were in train. They were about 20 miles apart. And they suddenly both became aware of lights to their left as they went east, lights that were converging on their aircraft at very high speeds. It alarmed both of them. One was a former A-10 pilot, a Warthog pilot for the Air Force. The other one was an F-16 pilot. And these lights approached both of them from the north, from their left, got alarmingly close to their aircraft in just a matter of seconds, and suddenly executed what appeared to the pilots to be a right-angle turn to the east, accelerated and disappeared over the horizon within a few seconds. So even 20 years ago, some pilots were willing to report their sightings.
It's good that it was two of them because they could collaborate, what they saw.
Yeah. I had both of them on a radio program. I don't think it was Arts, Coast to Coast. Might have been Jeff Rentz. And I'm sorry my memory isn't firing the way I'm accustomed to it.
No worries at all. Mine sometimes escapes me, so I understand completely. I'm sure the listeners do also.
Yeah.
We're getting close to the bottom of the hour. Did you have another event or?
Yes. Here's a good one. Meriwether County, Georgia, April 13th, 2003. 3 adults were driving on the outskirts of Meriwether, in the rural part of Meriwether County, Georgia. And 2 of them were brother and sister driving with a friend. The friend was driving the vehicle, the SUV, and he looked in his rearview mirror and he thought he was being stopped by flashing lights on a police cruiser. But he was quickly disabused of that notion. He was being followed by a cluster of small orbs about the size of a walnut that were clustered up around his rear window. And before they knew it, those orbs were on the inside of the vehicle. They apparently got passed through the windows, through solid windows, and they swarmed on the inside of the vehicle. And the driver had abdominal surgery shortly before this incident. And a large number of these small orbs suddenly clustered over the wound in his abdomen, surgical wound, and then equally quickly just disappeared. I don't know what to make of this. I get a lot of strange material. Some of it I believe, some I don't. But this is a case I happen to believe. The people were very high-quality reporters, and I think they were probably telling the truth.
Did they cause healing, or you think they were just... Did they help the wound heal, or did they just It's like they were doing an examination to see why he had that incision.
I don't know. It's a good question. One of the frustrating aspects of UFO work is more often than not, you get only part of the story. This is why a written report is so terribly important. Most people, as I mentioned earlier in this program, just want to call the hotline and chit-chat, I call it, about their sighting. But that doesn't serve to capture all the fine detail surrounding the sighting.
I can understand. I'd probably prefer a written report myself. You get more details, and the sooner they do it, the better. That way, they have remember everything. Yeah.
And the other reason I cite, people are annoyed when I don't want to listen to a 2-hour version of their UFO sighting, for example, a long-winded version.
Yeah, I could understand that too.
What many people don't stop to consider is the fact that every time you tell the story, the facts are at risk of being changed. You've probably seen the parlor games where they put 10 people on chairs right next to each other, and somebody whispers a word or a sentence into the ear of the first person, and that first person then turns to the second person and ostensibly whispers the same thing. By the time the story goes through 10 participants, it's completely different. Same is true of UFO reports. So the best thing to do is, if you believe you've seen a UFO, sit down and write down everything you can remember about the sighting, and then submit it to an organization like ours or like MUFON, and capture the information and make it available to the public. This is a job our government should be doing, but is not.
Well, it's like a police report. They want the victim to write it down in their own words what happened as soon as as soon as they get to the scene. That way, the memory is still fresh.
I just stumbled upon a case. I'm surprised it didn't come to the forefront of my mind earlier in the program. The O'Hare Airport case in Chicago, Illinois, November 7th, 2006. Dozens of airline personnel and even FAA personnel in the tower saw a disc hovering above gate C-17 at O'Hare Airport, and it hovered there for quite a long time. The pilot and co-pilot of an airliner that was just about to leave the gate opened their side windows and poked their heads out and saw the disc directly above them. Neither one of them would talk to us, unfortunately, but it was a celebrated case, and people highly experienced in the aviation industry saw that object and were shocked by it.
Did any bystanders see it?
Not that we didn't receive any reports from passengers, unfortunately, but I suspect that there are many people who saw it and didn't report it.
Yeah.
I'd like to revisit that issue. I made the point earlier that few people report their sightings. I get calls all day long from people who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s who saw UFOs as children or adults and never reported it and wanted to know what they could do about it. Many people are interested to know whether we're interested in older cases or not, and my response to that is absolutely we're interested in them. In fact, some of those cases are even more interesting than more recent cases. So if we have any listeners who've seen UFOs but who have not reported them, I would urge them to go to our website or get somebody to lead them to our website, ufocenter.com, and capture that data. I've heard many stories about people whose parents or grandparents have passed away who used to tell dramatic stories to their family members about UFOs they'd allegedly seen, but they didn't write it down. If it's not written down, it doesn't count.
I'd recommend that to everybody too. If you see one, write the event down as soon as possible. That way you don't forget any details.
Yeah. I'm looking at a case on this list I alluded to earlier, and takes me back to St. Louis, June 1st, 2012. A St. Louis law enforcement officer and his wife and daughter were driving south from St. Louis on an interstate. I think it's Interstate 55. if I'm not mistaken. And they saw a cluster of orange objects streaking ahead of them from the west, passing in front of their car. They didn't know what they were, but during that overflight of the interstate, there was a major accident, and the police officer had to proceed to work as helping the victims of the accident. It was a good case, and the police officer was a very solid witness. And I mentioned earlier, here's another case from Athens, Texas, July 5th, 2013. A former U.S. astronaut who'd been a fighter pilot in his earlier career and later an airline pilot watches as 6 red lights pass directly overhead, moving from east to west. A few years ago, the first case I remember of so-called orbs was from Tinley Park, Illinois, near Chicago. Clusters of orange or red lights were seen maneuvering relative to one another and moving in the night sky. And I don't know how many reports we have, but it's many of so-called orbs or clusters of red lights. It's an interesting phenomenon. We have as far as I know, nobody's come up with any adequate explanation for what they are.
Yeah, because it's not aviation lights.
Yeah. Another case I'd like to share with our audience comes from Glendale, Arizona. I mention it because after I took over the hotline in July of 1994, once we got the hotline hooked up to my home phone, the first report I took over the hotline was from Glendale, Arizona. Makes me a little nostalgic to think of this, but an Arizona Highway Patrol officer, off duty or in retirement, I don't know which, was standing inside his home looking to the north, and he saw an orange light move rapidly from east to west. It was so dramatic, he rushed outside to see what had caused the phenomenon, and he proceeded to watch another 150, he thought the number was, orange lights go streaking across his property at very high speed. He was shaken by it. He was a very good witness. In fact, we find most military and police personnel are some of the best witnesses we find, together with airline pilots. I'm looking for another good...
You ever get any reports from submarine personnel with the underwater sightings?
Yes. In fact, that brings to mind an incident. I used to be a skier before I fell ill, and I think it was mid-January of 1993. It was just shortly before Bill Clinton was inaugurated president. I met a fellow who had been a submariner at a friend's house, and when he heard my interest in UFOs, this is prior to my taking over the hotline, he had served aboard a U.S. submarine, Navy submarine, and he asserts that at one time they were on routine patrol, and suddenly the entire submarine went dark and they lost all the power in the sub, to include emergency lights. They have emergency lights such that if the power system fails, the emergency lights, which are battery powered, automatically come on. They did not. They were in total darkness in a submarine.
That'd be
How
scary.
long that lasted, I don't know.
Yeah, that'd be spooky right there.
Yeah, but he thought that was very strange, and I'd love to get a report of that incident by anybody who has witness to it. That's a point I'd like to revisit for a moment. People often ask me how many reports there are, how many incidents there are that could be reported. And I estimate, based on my 30 years' work, that out of somewhere between 10 and 30,000 sightings of actual UFOs, all of ufology manages to capture one of those incidents, one out of up to 30,000 in written form. Most of the data is slipping away from us just because, for many reasons, but mostly people say, well, I don't want people to think I'm a nut, so I won't talk about it or I won't write about it. But I explain to them that we guarantee anonymity. If somebody submits a report to the National UFO Reporting Center, we guarantee them that we will not release their personal information, name, address, phone number, or any of that, email address.
Yes, sir. That's a good deal, too. A lot of people are just, like you say, they're afraid somebody will think they're crazy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't think that, but,
Yeah. Here's another case I'd like to share. Lake Coeur d'Alene, just east of Spokane, pretty much in my backyard. May 6th, 2016, a husband and wife were sleeping on their sailboat in a place called Beauty Bay, which is in northern Coeur d'Alene Lake, Lake Coeur d'Alene, I guess it's pronounced. And they were suddenly awakened by a blindingly bright light streaming into the cabin of their anchored sailboat. And the husband went out on the deck at his wife's encouragement, and he saw a craft hovering between two mountains to the west of Lake Coeur d'Alene suddenly streaked off. What that craft was, I have no idea, of course, but there are a lot of excellent reports, and I encourage anybody who's interested in this subject to go to our website, ufocenter.com, and just scroll through the reports and sort them according to the subject that interests you, whether it be the type of craft seen or the physical location. Again, as I've mentioned before, you can sort all of the reports by several criteria. There's even a category devoted to sightings by pilots, which are some of the better reports we've gotten.
Yeah, you also have a UFO sighting map there, and I've seen some drawings and representations of some of the craft people have seen.
Yeah. The problem with maps is it's so difficult unless you're good at triangulation. It's difficult to know how far away the object is. People can say, well, it was over San Francisco, but it could have been over Oakland or it could have been over St. Louis because they don't know how far away the object was.
That's true.
Unless you have two or more people looking at the same target at the same time and measuring angles and angles of elevation, it's very difficult to gauge accurately where that object is. All you can do is plot where the witness was. That's fairly easy to do.
It's not like getting a number of people out trying to triangulate a RF signal.
Yeah. We had one case in Port Angeles. I don't know the date right off the top of my head, but a former Canadian CF-104 pilot, a starfighter pilot, which is a type of fighter jet from the 50s and 60s, was driving from a skiing area up north of Vancouver, BC, and he saw a blue-green light go streaking by his car. Well, that was seen over Bangor Submarine Base. It stopped over Bangor Submarine Base and hovered there for quite some time, several minutes, I think. It must have scared the daylights out of the U.S. Navy because it's the major subbase of the Northwest, and they're reputed to store what are euphemistically referred to as special weapons there. And the object then was reported from southern Washington. It was seen to accelerate and streak down the highway. We have one report from a driver on the Interstate 5 who saw it, got down to southern Washington, and then it reversed its course and streaked back north, disappearing from sight. What it was, I have no idea, but it doesn't sound like it's one of ours. Getting a little hoarse.
Oh, I understand. If you'd like, I could give the closeout questions. And
Yeah.
What do you hope the legacy is of the UFO Reporting Center?
Well, I hope more people will learn about it and access our site. I think the part of it that I'm most pleased about is the independence. We have done something that government should have done, but didn't. Everybody's interested in the subject, and it appears that we're dealing with a very real phenomenon that the government doesn't want to talk about, and it's an extremely important subject. After all, if our planet is being visited by alien spacecraft, I think the American people have a right to know that. No matter what the outcome, they should be allowed to share in the information that the government has. Government has crash saucers. I'd like to know about that. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Carl.
No, that's fine. I agree with you. I don't know if they're worried about we can't handle it. I don't think I would have trouble, after all the years that I've been alive and all the reports that I've seen and read. I'm not freaked out about it. Of course, I'm sure there may be some, but probably not as many as they think.
Yeah. I suspect Bob Lazar is correct. We have crash saucers that we reverse engineered, and the government hasn't shared that with us.
Yeah.
Again, it takes me back to that telephone call I received on the 6th of July. I've forgotten the year. I think it was 2004, from the CIA officer who said, if you build the equipment you describe in your article, Peter, you will be successful in answering the question of whether UFOs are real or not. He was, I think, coaxing me to get that job done and get the equipment made.
Well, feel free, if we have any more Phoenix-like type sightings, to contact me. And when the passive radar is up and running full blown, contact me and we'll have you back on the air.
That sounds good.
All righty, sir.
It's been a pleasure. It warms my heart to be here and to have been invited onto the program. And it brings very fond memories of Art Bell.
Well, I appreciate that. I know I'm not as good as he was, but I'm working on it.
Oh, you're a gentleman to work with.
I thank you, sir.
You have a good style, and been a pleasure to work with you.
I appreciate it. And like I say, anytime you want to come back, you just ring me up.
Thank you.
All righty, sir.
Very good. Thanks for the airtime. I apologize for my voice. As you know, I'm suffering from a malady that makes talking a little difficult. I hope people will give an allowance for that.
I'm sure they will. And I sure appreciate you, taking as much time as you have. I know it's sometimes tiring, but I will let you get on with your evening and hope you get a good rest tonight. And we'll speak to you at a later time.
Thanks again for the airtime, Carl. It's been a pleasure.
All right, sir. Appreciate you.
Good night.